We are now, though, going to move on to politics. And President Trump facing a tricky choice now after congressional leaders cut a deal to slap sanctions on Russia, punishing that country for meddling in our elections.
Now, the administration was against this legislation. So will Trump sign the bill, which has overwhelming bipartisan support? It comes as we head into a week in which both the president's son, Don Jr., and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will be meeting behind closed doors with congressional investigators looking into this Russia issue.
The president himself launched an unusually robust tweet storm this weekend with 10 tweets blasting everything from leaks, defending his son, bringing up his own power to pardon even.
Georgia is standing by this morning, but we're going to send it first to ABC's David Wright, who's at the White House for us this morning. David, good morning to you.
Good morning, Paula and Dan. You know, the White House may have retooled its communications operation, but they're still struggling to clear up the message. And this weekend has already brought several new controversies and questions. In a ceremony full of pomp and naval tradition,
Ship's company, attention!
President Trump sought to highlight his efforts to make the U.S. military bigger, better, and stronger.
American steel and American hands have constructed a 100,000-ton message to the world.
Trump made no mention of the fact that the USS Gerald Ford came in late and over budget by nearly $3 billion, 25%, though he has been critical of those cost overruns before. On this occasion, he asked for the sailors' help in passing a new budget that calls for an extra $74 billion in military spending over 2 years.
So call that congressman and call that senator and make sure you get it. And by the way, you can also call those senators to make sure you get health care.
The commander-in-chief appearing to order men and women in uniform to support him politically. That's a break with tradition. Congress is not making it easy for Trump, adopting parliamentary rules that'll require 60 votes on major portions of the Republican health care bill. The Senate and House also agreeing Saturday to force the White House to get their approval before easing Russian sanctions, a provision the administration has lobbied against. As Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner heads to Capitol Hill this week to be interviewed behind closed doors in the Russia probe, the president pointedly asserted on Twitter that all agree the U.S. president has the complete power to pardon. But Trump insists he's not even thinking about doing that because, he insists, the only crime so far is leaks against us. Now, last night, the president's personal lawyer, Jay Sekulow, spoke to reporters in Denver, where he's attending a conservative conference, and he insisted that the Trump legal team is not looking into the question of pardons because, he says, it's not an issue. But some legal scholars have suggested that the Constitution's unclear on whether the president could pardon himself. And some have suggested that if he were to do so, it would provoke a constitutional crisis. Dan and Paula?
All right, David Wright reporting from the White House for us this morning. David, thank you. We want to bring in our chief anchor, George Stephanopoulos. He'll be hosting this week a little bit later this morning. George, good morning to you. We want to talk about the issue of pardoning that David Wright just brought up, and he mentioned that Jay Sekulow, his lawyer, was speaking about this last night, doesn't know where this came from, and, quote, says what's going on in Washington is an attack of the president. So at the end of the day, whether or not the president is researching it, we know he's tweeting about it, can the president pardon himself?
Well, that question has actually never been tested because no president has ever tried it before. Most constitutional scholars believe that a president cannot pardon himself on the principle that no person, even a president, is above the law. In fact, that's the finding of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel back in 1974 during the Richard Nixon case. But again, that has not been tested. And the Washington Post did report this week that the president's team had been looking and researching into the question of pardons. The president had even asked, according to the Washington Post, about whether he had the power to pardon himself.
This bill to slap sanctions on Russia for meddling in our elections, as Paula said, has bipartisan support. The White House has been wary, to say the least. Do you think Trump's going to sign it?
Hard to imagine that he will not sign it because it has overwhelming support. I think it passed 98-2 in the Senate. It's going to be up on the House calendar by a provision that will ensure that it passes by more than 2/3 votes. But as David pointed out, the White House has been against some provisions which restrain the president's flexibility on sanctions. But when you've got a bill that imposes sanctions on Russia and Iran and North Korea, hard to imagine the president won't sign it. I will be asking the president's new press secretary, Sarah Sanders, about that this morning on This Week.
And speaking of the communication shakeups, Anthony Scaramucci, also known as Mooch, the new comms director, signals a vastly different communications approach. I know from your time in the White House as communications director, how much can this alter the course of the administration? But you saw Mooch at the end of that first press conference blowing kisses to the media, seemingly warming up to them.
Anybody who served in the White House in the communications shop, what communications director, press secretary, has a joke shared across partisan lines. Whenever something goes wrong in the White House, it's a communications problem. There are often other things going on behind it. It can probably make a bit of difference at the margins, to have a friendly face out there. But the real issue is going to be, what do those people say from the podium? Do they tell the truth? Can they defend President Trump's actions? What's going to be happening on the rest of the president's agenda? If things aren't going well in the rest of the White House, even a nice smile at the podium is not going to make a big difference.
George Stephanopoulos, thank
George.
you. I want to remind everybody, George has a big show this morning. 3 exclusive interviews. He's going to go one-on-one with Trump legal team member Jay Sekulow, as well as he said, new White House press secretary Sarah Sanders after that big White House shakeup, plus the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer discussing the Democratic Party's new economic agenda. That's coming up later this morning on This Week, right here on ABC. Thanks again, George.
Thanks again, George.